Rain lashed down on the auction platform in Trinidad, Colorado, the autumn of 1879, turning the dirt streets into rivers of mud as Winifred Rhodes stood trembling in a soaked cotton dress. She had never imagined her life would come to this, being sold to the highest bidder like cattle at market, her father's gambling debts having sealed her fate more thoroughly than any wedding vows could have. The auctioneer's voice competed with the thunder, his words slicing through the downpour as he extolled her virtues like a man selling a prize mare. 20 years old, strong back, educated, can read and write, makes a fine stew and can sew a straight seam. Starting bid is $50. Winifred stared at her bare feet, mud splashing up her ankles with each shift of her weight. Her auburn hair, usually her pride, hung in wet ropes around her face. She refused to look at the men gathered below the platform, miners, shopkeepers, and ranchers from all around Las Animas County, their eyes appraising her worth in dollars and cents rather than humanity. $50, came a gravelly voice from the crowd. 60, shouted another. 75. The bidding continued, the price of her life climbing higher. The auctioneer grinned beneath his dripping hat. I hear 75. Do I hear 80 for this fine young woman? Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the crowd for a brief moment. It was then that she saw him, a tall figure at the back, standing apart from the others. Unlike the men huddled under awnings or holding newspapers over their heads, this stranger stood directly in the downpour, seemingly indifferent to the storm raging around him. $100, he called out, his voice quiet yet somehow cutting through the din of rain and thunder. A murmur went through the crowd. The bidding had jumped significantly. $100 from the gentleman in the back, the auctioneer pointed with excitement. Do I hear 110? 120, countered a portly man near the front, a shopkeeper Winifred recognized as having a reputation for cruelty toward his workers. The mysterious figure stepped forward, his face still shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. $200, he stated flatly, silencing the crowd. The auctioneer's eyes widened at the unexpected sum. $200, going once, going twice. $250, the shopkeeper wasn't giving up easily. The tall man removed his hat then, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, with eyes as gray as the storm clouds above. $500, he said, his gaze never leaving Winifred's face. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. No debt bride had ever fetched such a price in Trinidad. $500, the auctioneer nearly danced with glee. Going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman in the back. Winifred finally raised her eyes to meet those of her purchaser as he strode forward through the mud and rain. His long, oilskin coat shed water like a duck's back as he climbed the steps to the platform. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with a strong jaw partially hidden beneath a neatly trimmed beard. A cowboy, judging by his attire and the way he carried himself. Name's Fletcher Calloway, he said quietly for her ears alone. I own the Double C Ranch outside of town. He removed his coat and placed it around her shoulders in a gesture that surprised her with its gentleness. Why? She whispered, clutching the edges of the coat around her shivering body. His gray eyes studied her face. No one should be sold like property, especially not in a storm like this. The auctioneer thrust papers at Fletcher. Sign here, Mr. Calloway. She's yours legal and proper once you do. Fletcher signed with a flourish, then handed over a leather pouch heavy with coins. Come along, Miss Rhodes, he said, offering his arm. Let's get you somewhere dry. Winifred hesitated, then slipped her arm through his, having little choice but to trust this stranger who now owned her future. As they descended the platform steps, the crowd parted before them like the Red Sea. My belongings, she started, thinking of the small trunk containing the only possessions she had left in the world. Where are they? Fletcher asked. At the sheriff's office. He was holding them until I was sold. The words tasted bitter on her tongue. Fletcher nodded and led her through the muddy streets toward the sheriff's office. The rain continued its assault, but Winifred felt oddly protected beneath the cowboy's strong arm. She still didn't understand why this man had paid such an astronomical sum for her. $500 was enough to buy a decent piece of land or several good horses. It made no sense. Sheriff Dawson looked up from his desk when they entered, his bushy eyebrows rising at the sight of them. That was quick, he commented, rising from his chair. Got the paperwork all signed, Calloway? It's done, Fletcher confirmed, his tone clipped. Miss Rhodes's belongings, the sheriff jerked his thumb toward a small trunk in the corner. That's all she's got. Fletcher approached the trunk. Is this it? He asked Winifred. She nodded, embarrassed by how little she possessed. Without another word, Fletcher hoisted the trunk onto his shoulder. We'll be going now, Sheriff. Hold on, Sheriff Dawson said, stepping from behind his desk. You understand the terms. She's bound to you for 3 years to work off her father's debt. What you have her do is your business, but the law says you can't mistreat her. Something dangerous flashed in Fletcher's eyes. I'm well aware of the law, Sheriff, more so than those who'd allow a woman to be sold in a downpour. The sheriff had the decency to look uncomfortable. Just doing my job, Calloway. As am I. Fletcher turned to Winifred. Ready, Miss Rhodes? She nodded, eager to leave the sheriff's scrutiny behind. Outside, the rain had slackened slightly, but the streets were still awash with mud. Fletcher led her to a covered wagon parked near the general store. I had business in town today, he explained, securing her trunk in the back. Wasn't expecting to return with company. He helped her onto the bench seat, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. With a click of his tongue, he set the team of horses in motion, guiding them through town and onto the road heading west. They traveled in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves and the rain pattering on the canvas cover above them. Winifred stole glances at her purchaser, trying to read his intentions in the stern lines of his profile. You can ask your questions, Miss Rhodes, he said suddenly, startling her. I imagine you have many. Winifred gathered her courage. Why did you buy me? $500 is. A fair price for freedom, he finished for her. I don't understand, Fletcher sighed, his eyes remaining on the road ahead. My ranch is 10 miles outside of town. I need help running the place, cooking, cleaning, tending the garden. My last housekeeper left to get married 3 months ago. So I'm to be your housekeeper? Relief flooded through her at the thought of such respectable work. You'll have your own room in the house. It's modest but comfortable. He glanced at her briefly. I won't ask anything improper of you if that's your concern. Winifred felt her cheeks flush. Of course that had been her concern. Most men who purchased debt brides had expectations that had nothing to do with housekeeping. 3 years is a long time, she ventured. Less than you'd have served anyone else in that crowd, he pointed out. And I intend to pay you wages after the first year. You can save for your future. This revelation stunned her into silence. No one paid debt brides wages. It wasn't required by law. Why would you do that? She finally asked. Fletcher's hands tightened on the reins. Because I know what it means to be bound to another's will against your own choosing. Before she could ask what he meant, he continued, the Double C isn't a large operation. I run about 200 head of cattle with the help of 3 ranch hands. They live in the bunkhouse and won't bother you. The rain began to ease as they traveled farther from town, the clouds breaking to reveal patches of blue sky. Winifred watched as the landscape opened up around them, rolling hills covered in prairie grass, stands of ponderosa pine in the distance, and the magnificent Sangre de Cristo Mountains rising to the west. It's beautiful, she murmured, the majesty of the land momentarily distracting her from her circumstances. Fletcher's expression softened. Yes, it is. Most beautiful country in Colorado, I'd say. Have you always lived here? He shook his head. Came west after the war. Worked as a drover, then a foreman, saved every penny until I could buy my own place 5 years ago. You fought in the war. Winifred studied him with new interest. Union cavalry. His tone suggested he didn't wish to elaborate further. They fell silent again as the wagon bumped along the muddy road. Winifred's mind raced with questions and uncertainties. Her father had gambled away everything, including their small farm in Kansas, before disappearing in the night and leaving her to face his creditors. The law allowed for family members to be held accountable for debts when the debtor fled, and as his only living relative, Winifred had been sentenced to servitude. Your father, Fletcher said after a while, as if reading her thoughts. What became of him? Winifred stared at her hands folded in her lap. I don't know. He left in the night 6 weeks ago. The sheriff in Dodge City said he might have headed to California. Fletcher made a sound of disgust. Leaving his daughter to pay his debts, what kind of man does that? A desperate one, Winifred replied softly. After my mother died last year, he wasn't the same, started drinking, gambling, said he was trying to make enough money so we could move somewhere better. And instead lost everything. She nodded, fighting back tears. Even the locket with my mother's portrait inside, that's when I knew he'd truly lost himself. Fletcher's expression darkened. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Rhodes, both of them. The genuine sympathy in his voice threatened to undo her composure. Winifred had spent weeks holding herself together, refusing to break down even when the sheriff explained she would be auctioned to settle her father's debts. But this stranger's kindness was almost more than she could bear. Thank you, Mr. Calloway, she managed, blinking rapidly. As they crested a hill, Fletcher pointed ahead. There it is, Double C Ranch. Winifred followed his gaze to a valley below where a tidy collection of buildings nestled alongside a winding creek. A two-story house built of sturdy logs stood in the center, with a barn, corral, and several outbuildings arranged nearby. Smoke curled from the house's stone chimney, and even from this distance she could see cattle grazing in the meadows beyond. It's lovely, she said truthfully. After the uncertainty of the past weeks, the sight of what would be her home for the next 3 years brought unexpected comfort. Fletcher guided the wagon down the hill and across a wooden bridge spanning the creek. As they approached the house, a dog came bounding out to greet them, a large black and white border collie with one blue eye and one brown. That's Scout, Fletcher said, a hint of pride in his voice. Best cattle dog in the county. The dog barked happily, racing circles around the wagon as they pulled up in front of the house. Winifred noticed flower beds flanking the front porch, though they looked somewhat neglected. The gardens need attention, Fletcher said, following her gaze. Mrs. Abernathy, my former housekeeper, had quite the green thumb. They've suffered in her absence. I enjoy gardening, Winifred offered. My mother taught me. Fletcher nodded approvingly as he set the brake and jumped down from the wagon. He came around to help her down, his hands strong and steady at her waist. The contact, brief as it was, sent an unexpected flutter through her stomach. Before either could speak, the front door opened, and an older woman emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. There you are, Fletcher. I was beginning to worry with that storm rolling through. The woman's curious gaze fell on Winifred. And who might this be, Mrs. Larson? Fletcher addressed the woman. This is Miss Winifred Rhodes. She'll be taking over as housekeeper. Miss Rhodes, this is Mrs. Edna Larson, our neighbor from the next ranch over. She's been kind enough to help out since Mrs. Abernathy left. Mrs. Larson's eyebrows rose slightly, her gaze taking in Winifred's bedraggled appearance and Fletcher's coat still draped around her shoulders. Well now, that's welcome news indeed. Come inside, dear, you look half drowned. Winifred followed Mrs. Larson into the house while Fletcher retrieved her trunk. The interior was surprisingly comfortable, a large main room with a stone fireplace, sturdy wooden furniture, and shelves filled with books. The floors were polished pine with colorful rag rugs scattered about. You'll want to get into some dry clothes, Mrs. Larson said kindly. I've kept a stew simmering all afternoon, nothing like hot food after being caught in the rain. Fletcher entered with Winifred's trunk. I'll take this up to your room, he said. Mrs. Larson, could you show Miss Rhodes where she'll be staying? Of course. The older woman gestured for Winifred to follow her up a narrow staircase. Fletcher's a good man, she said quietly as they climbed. Whatever circumstances brought you here, you could have fared much worse. Winifred wasn't sure how to respond to that. He paid a considerable sum for my debt contract. Mrs. Larson glanced back at her, something knowing in her expression. Did he now? That's interesting. They reached the second floor, where a hallway ran the length of the house with doors on either side. Fletcher's room is at the end there. Mrs. Larson indicated the door at the far end of the hall. This will be yours. She opened the second door on the right. The room was modest but pleasant, a bed with a patchwork quilt, a dresser with a mirror, a small writing desk beneath a window overlooking the valley, and a rocking chair in the corner. It's lovely, Winifred breathed, surprised by the comfort it offered. Fletcher appeared in the doorway with her trunk, which he set at the foot of the bed. The washroom is across the hall, he explained. We have running water, had pipes laid last year. It's cold, but there's a pump in the kitchen for hot water if you need it. Winifred couldn't hide her surprise. Running water was a luxury she hadn't expected on a ranch so far from town. "I'll leave you to get settled," Fletcher said. "Supper in an hour." "That would be fine, thank you." When Fletcher had gone, Mrs. Larson lingered, her kind eyes studying Winifred. "You have questions, I imagine." About Fletcher, Winifred hesitated, then nodded. "He keeps to himself mostly," Mrs. Larson said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Came here after the war with nothing but determination and the clothes on his back. Worked harder than any 3 men to build this place." She paused. "Lost his wife and baby during the war. Confederate raiders." Winifred's hand flew to her mouth. "How terrible." "He doesn't talk about it," Mrs. Larson continued, "but it shaped him, made him the man he is, fair, honest, sometimes too serious for his own good." "Why are you telling me this?" The older woman smiled gently. "So you understand, Fletcher Calloway isn't the type to buy a woman at auction. Something about you must have stirred something in him he thought long dead." Winifred felt her cheeks grow warm. "I think he merely felt sorry for me, perhaps, Mrs. Larson rose from the bed. "I'll let you change. There's a wash basin in the corner there." Left alone, Winifred slowly removed Fletcher's coat, hanging it carefully on a hook by the door. She opened her trunk and selected a simple blue dress, less sodden than what she currently wore. As she changed, her mind turned over Mrs. Larson's words about Fletcher losing his family. Perhaps that explained the sadness she sometimes glimpsed in his gray eyes. After washing her face and hands and attempting to tame her damp hair, Winifred made her way downstairs. She found Fletcher and Mrs. Larson in the kitchen, a warm, inviting space dominated by a large wood stove and a rectangular oak table. "Ah, there you are," Mrs. Larson said cheerfully. "Feeling more human now, I expect." "Much better, thank you." Winifred hovered uncertainly in the doorway. Fletcher pulled out a chair for her. "Please sit. Mrs. Larson's stew is legendary in these parts." The meal was indeed delicious, a hearty beef stew with vegetables from Mrs. Larson's garden, served with fresh baked bread still warm from the oven. Winifred realized how hungry she was, having eaten little that day due to nerves about the auction. As they ate, Fletcher outlined her duties. "Breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, supper at 6 in the evening. The ranch hands take their noon meal in the bunkhouse but join us for supper." He paused. "There's washing, cleaning, gardening if you're of a mind to revive those flower beds. I don't expect perfection, just honest effort." "I'll do my best," Winifred promised. "Sundays are for rest," he continued. "We ride into town for church when weather permits." Mrs. Larson reached over to pat Winifred's hand. "I'll come by tomorrow to help you get oriented to the kitchen and pantry, and I've put fresh linens on your bed." "That's very kind of you." After supper, Mrs. Larson took her leave, explaining that her husband would be wondering where she was. Fletcher walked her out to her waiting buggy, leaving Winifred alone to explore the kitchen. She was examining the pantry's contents when Fletcher returned, bringing with him the scent of rain-washed air. "More storm clouds moving in," he remarked, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "We could use the rain for the winter wheat." Winifred nodded, trying to appear knowledgeable about farming concerns, though her experience was limited to the small vegetable garden she'd tended with her mother. Fletcher seemed to sense her discomfort. "I imagine this has been an overwhelming day for you, Miss Rhodes. Please don't feel you need to begin your duties this evening. Rest, and we can start fresh tomorrow." "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." He hesitated, then said, "Fletcher, please." "Mr. Calloway was my father, and he wasn't a man I care to be reminded of." The personal admission surprised her. "Then you must call me Winifred." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Winifred." He tested the name, and she found she liked the way he said it. "Well then, Winifred, I have some ledgers to review. The lamp in your room has oil, and there are books in the main room if you care to read." "I think I'll retire early if that's all right. It's been quite a day." Fletcher nodded, understanding. "Of course. Good night, then." "Good night." Fletcher. Upstairs in her room, Winifred unpacked her meager possessions, 2 dresses besides the one she wore, undergarments, a nightgown, a hairbrush, and a small Bible that had belonged to her mother. She changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sound of rain beginning to patter against the roof once more. Her life had changed so dramatically in just a few short weeks. From a farmer's daughter in Kansas to a debt bride in Colorado, now bound to a man she barely knew for the next 3 years. Yet, strangely, she felt safer than she had in months. Fletcher Calloway might own her debt contract, but he had shown her more respect in one afternoon than she'd received from anyone since her father disappeared. With that comforting thought, Winifred slipped between the clean sheets and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through her window. For a moment, Winifred was disoriented, forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came flooding back. She rose quickly, realizing that her first duty would be preparing breakfast. She dressed in her blue gingham dress, pinned her auburn hair in a simple knot at the nape of her neck, and hurried downstairs. To her surprise, Fletcher was already in the kitchen, coffee brewing on the stove and bacon sizzling in a cast iron skillet. "Good morning," he said, glancing up from the stove. "Hope you slept well." "I did, thank you," she replied, embarrassed that she'd overslept on her first morning. "I'm sorry I wasn't up earlier to prepare breakfast." Fletcher waved away her apology. "You had a trying day yesterday." "Besides, I'm used to cooking for myself." He gestured to the coffee pot. "Help yourself, cups are in the cabinet above." Winifred poured herself a cup of the strong black coffee, then set about finding eggs and bread for breakfast. Together, they prepared a simple meal of bacon, eggs, and toast. Fletcher showed her where everything was kept in the kitchen, explaining his preferences with an ease that suggested he was accustomed to managing on his own. "The men will be in shortly," he said as they set the food on the table. "They're curious about you, but they're good fellows, respectful." As if on cue, the back door opened, and 3 men entered, removing their hats as they saw Winifred. Fletcher introduced them. Daniel, the oldest at around 50 with weathered skin and kind eyes, brothers James and Thomas, both in their 20s with the lean, tough builds of men who worked hard for a living. "Miss Rhodes is our new housekeeper," Fletcher explained. "She'll be with us for a while, so mind your manners and your language." The men nodded politely, though Winifred could sense their curiosity. She wondered if they knew the circumstances of her arrival but was too embarrassed to ask. Breakfast passed pleasantly enough, with the men discussing the day's work ahead, mending fences damaged in the recent storm, moving cattle to a different pasture, and preparing for the coming winter. Winifred served seconds of everything and refilled coffee cups, trying to appear efficient and useful. After the ranch hands had gone out to begin their work, Fletcher lingered at the table, finishing his coffee. "I'll be out with the men most of the day," he told her. "Mrs. Larson should be by mid-morning to help you get oriented. Feel free to arrange the kitchen however suits you best." Winifred nodded, grateful for the freedom to organize her workspace. "Is there anything specific you'd like for supper tonight?" Fletcher seemed pleased by the question. "Whatever you're comfortable preparing. We're not fussy eaters here." After he left, Winifred set about cleaning up the breakfast dishes and exploring the kitchen more thoroughly. Mrs. Larson arrived as promised, bringing with her a basket of fresh eggs and garden vegetables. "Fletcher tells me you settled in well," the older woman said, setting her basket on the table. "I thought we might make a beef roast for supper. The men work hard and they appreciate hearty meals." For the next several hours, Mrs. Larson showed Winifred the routines of the ranch house where linens were stored, how the stove drafted best, which vegetables in the root cellar needed using first. They prepared the roast together, with Mrs. Larson demonstrating how to make a savory gravy that would stretch the meal further. "Fletcher's a good provider," Mrs. Larson commented as they worked. "Never skimps on food for his hands or comforts for the house, but he's been alone too long. A man needs a home, not just a house." Winifred concentrated on peeling potatoes, uncomfortable with the implication of Mrs. Larson's words. "I'm just the housekeeper," she reminded the older woman quietly. Mrs. Larson's eyes twinkled knowingly. "For now, perhaps, time has a way of changing things." Before Winifred could respond, they heard the back door open and Fletcher entered, his shirt damp with sweat from the morning's work. "Ladies," he greeted them, crossing to the wash basin to clean his hands. "Something smells wonderful." "Roast for supper," Mrs. Larson informed him. "Your new housekeeper has a natural touch in the kitchen." Fletcher's eyes met Winifred's briefly, a hint of warmth in them that made her heart skip. "I'm glad to hear it." He stayed only long enough to drink a cup of water before heading back out to join his men. When he'd gone, Mrs. Larson turned to Winifred with a smile. "He's checking on you," she said, "making sure you're settling in." He's merely being conscientious, Winifred countered, though she couldn't deny the fluttering sensation in her chest when Fletcher had looked at her. The rest of the day passed quickly as Winifred settled into her new role. She cleaned the main rooms of the house, discovering a talent for homemaking she hadn't fully developed in her father's small farmhouse. By late afternoon, the house smelled of roasting beef and baking bread, and Winifred felt a surprising sense of accomplishment. Mrs. Larson left before supper, claiming her husband would be wondering where his own meal was. "You'll do just fine," she assured Winifred with a parting hug. "This place already feels more like a home with you in it." Supper was a success, with the ranch hands praising the tender roast and fluffy rolls. Fletcher said little, but Winifred noticed how his eyes followed her movements as she served the meal and cleared the dishes afterward. It made her both self-conscious and oddly pleased to have his attention. After the men had returned to the bunkhouse for the evening, Fletcher helped her wash the remaining dishes, a gesture that surprised her. "You needn't do that," she protested. "It's my job." "My mother taught me that everyone shares in the work of a home," he replied, drying a plate with practiced efficiency. "Besides, 4 hands make quicker work than 2. Working alongside him in the quiet kitchen, Winifred felt a strange companionship developing between them. Fletcher Calloway might own her debt contract, but he treated her as an equal, not a servant. "Tell me about yourself," he said as they finished the dishes. "Beyond what I already know," Winifred considered what to share. "There's not much to tell. I grew up in Kansas, an only child. My mother taught school before she married my father. She made sure I was educated reading, writing, mathematics. She hoped I might become a teacher someday." "And what did you hope?" The question caught her off guard. Few had ever asked what she wanted for herself. "I suppose I thought I'd marry eventually, have children," she shrugged slightly. "Ordinary dreams." "There's nothing ordinary about wanting a family," Fletcher said quietly. "It's the most extraordinary dream there is." Something in his tone made her wonder if he was thinking of the wife and child he'd lost. Mrs. Larson's revelation about his past lingered in her mind, but she didn't feel it was her place to ask. "What about you?" she ventured instead. "You said you came west after the war." Fletcher nodded, leaning against the counter. "Couldn't go back to Tennessee, too many ghosts." His jaw tightened momentarily. "Worked my way west, learned ranching from the ground up, saved every penny until I could buy this place." "You've built something wonderful here," Winifred said sincerely. A hint of pride crossed his features. "It's a good life, hard work but satisfying." He straightened up from the counter. "I should let you rest. You've had a busy day." "Good night, Fletcher," she said, surprised by how comfortable his name felt on her lips after just one day. "Good night, Winifred." As the days turned into weeks, Winifred settled into life at the Double C Ranch. October gave way to November, bringing colder temperatures and occasional snow flurries. She found satisfaction in keeping the house, cooking meals that brought appreciation from Fletcher and his men, and even reviving the neglected flower beds with hardy perennials that Mrs. Larson helped her transplant. Each Sunday, weather permitting, Fletcher drove her into Trinidad for church services. The first time, Winifred had been apprehensive about facing the townspeople, certain they would remember her as the woman auctioned in the rain. But Fletcher stayed close beside her, his presence silently daring anyone to make her uncomfortable. Gradually, she was accepted as Fletcher Calloway's housekeeper, nothing more or less. As winter settled over Colorado, the rhythm of ranch life slowed. Cattle were moved to sheltered pastures closer to the barn, and the men spent more time mending equipment and planning for spring. Evenings grew longer, and Winifred discovered that Fletcher was an avid reader. Often after supper, they would sit by the fire, each with a book, comfortable in shared silence. One such evening in early December, as snow fell gently outside, Fletcher closed his book and looked over at her. "Christmas is coming," he observed. "We usually have a small celebration here at the ranch. Nothing elaborate, but the men appreciate a special meal and perhaps some small gifts." Winifred set aside her own book. "I'd be happy to prepare a feast. My mother always made Christmas special, even when we had little." "I was hoping you'd say that." Fletcher hesitated, then continued, "I need to ride into town tomorrow for supplies. Would you care to join me? You might want to select things for the Christmas meal and perhaps find small gifts for the men." The invitation pleased her more than it should have. I'd like that very much. The next day dawned clear and cold, the world transformed into a white wonderland overnight. Fletcher brought the sleigh around instead of the wagon, explaining it would be easier to navigate the snow-covered roads. He helped Winifred onto the seat and tucked a thick buffalo robe around her legs before climbing up beside her. The journey to town was magical, the sleigh runners cutting smoothly through fresh snow, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air, the sun making the landscape sparkle like diamonds. Fletcher pointed out deer tracks crossing the road and a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. "It's beautiful," Winifred breathed, her face flushed with cold and excitement. Fletcher glanced at her, something softening in his expression. "Yes, it is." In Trinidad, the streets were busy with Christmas preparations. Fletcher secured the sleigh in front of the general store, then offered Winifred his arm as they navigated the snowy sidewalks. Inside the store, they were greeted warmly by the proprietor, Mr. Jenkins. Fletcher Calloway. "Good to see you." Mr. Jenkins's curious gaze fell on Winifred. "And Miss Rhodes, isn't it? Heard you're keeping house out at the Double C now." "She is," Fletcher confirmed, his tone discouraging further questions about their arrangement. They separated to do their shopping, Fletcher to order feed and supplies, Winifred to select ingredients for the Christmas meal and small gifts for the ranch hands. She chose warm woolen socks, handkerchiefs, and peppermint sticks, simple items that she hoped would be appreciated. As she browsed the fabric section, thinking of making new curtains for the kitchen, a woman approached her well-dressed, perhaps in her 30s, with a calculating look in her eye. "You're the debt bride Fletcher Calloway bought at auction, aren't you?" the woman asked without preamble. Winifred stiffened, her hands tightening on the bolt of gingham she'd been examining. "I'm Mr. Calloway's housekeeper," she replied carefully. The woman laughed, a brittle sound. "Is that what he calls it? Fletcher always was too noble for his own good." She leaned closer. "I'm Judith Blackwell. Fletcher and I were close before he rode into town that day and came home with you instead." Before Winifred could respond to this unexpected revelation, Fletcher appeared at her side, his face tight with controlled anger as he saw who she was speaking with. "Judith," he said coolly. "I see you've met Miss Rhodes." "Indeed I have," Judith replied, her smile not reaching her eyes. "I was just telling her how surprising it was when you brought her home instead of accepting my dinner invitation that evening." Fletcher's jaw clenched. "If you'll excuse us, we have errands to complete." He placed a hand gently at the small of Winifred's back, guiding her away. "What was that about?" Winifred asked once they were out of earshot, her mind whirling with questions. Fletcher sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Judith has been persistent in her attentions since her husband died last year. I've never encouraged her. She seemed to think otherwise." "Judith Blackwell sees what she wants to see," he replied tersely. "Are you finished shopping? I'd like to start back before the snow begins again." Winifred nodded, sensing he didn't wish to discuss Judith further. She paid for her selections, and Fletcher settled the bill for all their purchases with Mr. Jenkins. The ride home began in uncomfortable silence. Winifred couldn't stop thinking about Judith's implication that Fletcher had chosen to attend the auction rather than meet her for dinner. Had he specifically come to buy a debt bride that day? The thought made her stomach churn with uncertainty. "She wasn't telling the truth," Fletcher said suddenly, breaking the silence. "About us being close. Judith's been trying to secure a husband since William died and left her the mercantile. I've rebuffed her advances repeatedly." Relief washed over Winifred, followed immediately by confusion about why she should care who Fletcher Calloway spent time with. "You don't owe me any explanation," she said quietly. Fletcher glanced at her, his gray eyes troubled. "Perhaps not, but I don't want you believing her implications." They were nearing the bridge that crossed the creek, leading to the ranch when the snow began falling more heavily. Fletcher urged the horses to a faster pace, eager to reach home before the storm worsened. As they crossed the bridge, a sudden crack split the air. One of the sleigh runners hit a hidden obstacle, and the vehicle lurched violently to one side. Winifred cried out as she was thrown from her seat. Fletcher made a desperate grab for her, but she tumbled over the side of the sleigh into the snow-covered creek bank below. Pain shot through her ankle as she landed awkwardly on the frozen ground. Above her, she heard Fletcher calling her name, his voice tight with concern. Moments later, he was kneeling beside her in the snow, his hands gently checking for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his face pale with worry. "My ankle," she gasped, trying to sit up. "I think I twisted it." Without hesitation, Fletcher scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. The sudden proximity made her breath catch. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her side. Smell the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him. "Hold on," he instructed, carefully navigating the slippery bank back up to the road where the sleigh waited, the horses stamping nervously in the falling snow. He set her gently on the seat, then examined the damaged runner. "It's cracked but should hold until we reach the ranch if we go slowly." The remainder of the journey passed in tense silence, Fletcher concentrating on guiding the sleigh safely home while Winifred tried to ignore the throbbing pain in her ankle. When they finally reached the ranch, Fletcher carried her directly into the house, settling her on the sofa before building up the fire to ward off the chill. "Let me see that ankle," he said, kneeling before her and carefully removing her boot and stocking. His touch was gentle but sure as he examined the injury. "It's swelling, but I don't think it's broken. A bad sprain, most likely." Winifred bit her lip as he probed the tender flesh. "I'm sorry to be such trouble." Fletcher looked up at her, surprise evident in his expression. "You're not trouble, Winifred. Accidents happen." He rose and moved to a cabinet, returning with a bottle of whiskey and a clean cloth. "This will help with the pain while I fetch some bandages." The whiskey burned going down, but soon spread warmth through her body, dulling the sharp edges of the pain. Fletcher returned with bandages and a basin of cold water, kneeling once more to tend to her injury. As he wrapped her ankle with careful precision, Winifred studied his face, the furrow of concentration between his brows, the set of his jaw as he worked. There was something deeply comforting about being cared for by his capable hands. "Where did you learn to do this?" she asked, trying to distract herself from both the pain and her growing awareness of him. "Field hospitals during the war," he answered, securing the bandage. "You learn quickly or men die." A shadow passed over his features at the memory. When he finished, he didn't immediately move away. Instead, he remained kneeling before her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "You scared me today," he admitted quietly, "when I saw you fall." "I'm all right," she assured him. Touched by his concern, Fletcher nodded, finally rising to his feet. "You should stay off that ankle for a few days. I'll bring your meals here and anything else you need." "But my duties can wait," he interrupted firmly. "Your health is more important." The next few days passed in an unexpected intimacy as Fletcher cared for Winifred, bringing her meals, books to read, and sitting with her in the evenings by the fire. They talked more than they ever had before about books they'd read, places they'd been, dreams they'd once held. Fletcher shared stories of his childhood in Tennessee, of his brief time at university before the war erupted and changed everything. Winifred told him about her mother's gentle wisdom, her father's better days before grief and drink consumed him, her own small triumphs and disappointments. What neither of them mentioned was the growing tension between them, the way their hands sometimes brushed when passing a cup of tea, the lingering glances, the comfortable silences that seemed charged with unspoken feelings. By Christmas Eve, Winifred's ankle had improved enough that she insisted on helping prepare the holiday meal. Though Fletcher made her work seated at the kitchen table, her injured foot propped on a stool. The ranch hands joined them for a festive supper, exclaiming over the roast goose, sweet potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie that Winifred had managed to prepare despite her injury. Afterward, they exchanged gifts around the fire, the men delighted with their new socks and treats, presenting Winifred with a hand-carved wooden box they'd worked on together in secret. "For your treasures, Miss Winifred," Daniel explained gruffly. "Figured a lady should have someplace special to keep her special things." Tears pricked Winifred's eyes at the thoughtful gift. "It's beautiful. Thank you all so much." The men soon retreated to the bunkhouse, leaving Winifred and Fletcher alone by the firelight. She noticed he seemed nervous, fidgeting with something in his pocket. "I have something for you as well," he finally said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Fletcher, you didn't need to, I wanted to," he interrupted gently, placing the package in her hands. Winifred carefully untied the string and folded back the paper to reveal a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. Her breath caught as she opened it to find it empty, waiting for a keepsake. "I know it can't replace the one with your mother's portrait," Fletcher said quietly. "But perhaps it can hold new memories." Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at him. "It's perfect, thank you." Fletcher took the locket from her trembling fingers and moved behind her to fasten it around her neck. His fingers brushed the sensitive skin at her nape, sending shivers down her spine. "There," he murmured, his voice low near her ear. "It suits you." When he came around to face her again, something had changed in his expression, a new vulnerability, a question in his eyes that made her heart race. "Winifred," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle for words. These past weeks, a sudden pounding at the door interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Fletcher frowned, moving quickly to answer it. Daniel stood on the porch, snow swirling around him. "Sorry to disturb you, boss, but one of the pregnant heifers is having trouble. Looks like a breech birth." Fletcher immediately snapped to attention. "I'll be right there." He turned back to Winifred apologetically. "I have to go, this could take hours." "Of course," she nodded, understanding. "Go, I'll wait up." But despite her intention, the warmth of the fire and the long day's activities soon lulled Winifred to sleep on the sofa. She woke briefly when Fletcher returned in the early hours of Christmas morning, feeling herself being lifted in strong arms and carried upstairs to her bed. "Fletcher," she murmured sleepily. "Shh," he whispered, laying her gently on the bed and pulling a quilt over her. "Sleep now, we saved them both, mother and calf." She smiled at the good news, already drifting back towards sleep. Just before consciousness fully slipped away, she thought she felt the brush of lips against her forehead, but couldn't be certain it wasn't simply part of a dream. Christmas Day dawned bright and clear, the world outside transformed into a gleaming white landscape. Winifred rose early, her ankle much improved, and prepared a special breakfast of cinnamon rolls and sausages. Fletcher joined her in the kitchen, looking tired but content after the night's successful birthing. "Merry Christmas," he greeted her, his eyes warming as he noticed she was wearing the locket he'd given her. "Merry Christmas," she replied, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks under his appreciative gaze. "Thank you for carrying me up to bed last night. I didn't mean to fall asleep." "You looked peaceful," he said simply. "I didn't want to wake you." The day passed in quiet celebration. The men visited briefly to report that mother and calf were doing well before heading into town for Christmas festivities. Fletcher and Winifred spent the afternoon reading by the fire, sharing stories of Christmases past, and enjoying leftover goose for their supper. As evening fell, bringing with it another gentle snowfall, Fletcher stoked the fire and turned to Winifred with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Before we were interrupted last night," he began, "I wanted to tell you something." Winifred's heart quickened. "Yes," Fletcher moved to sit beside her on the sofa, closer than propriety might dictate. "These past months having you here, it's changed things, changed me." "How so?" she asked softly, hardly daring to breathe. He reached for her hand, enfolding it in his larger one. "When Sarah, my wife, died, I thought that part of me died too, the part that could feel anything beyond duty and work." He paused, struggling with the words. "I never expected to find myself caring for someone again." Winifred felt tears prick her eyes at his confession. "Fletcher, please let me finish," he said gently. "I know our situation is complicated. I hold your debt contract, and that creates an imbalance I've tried to respect. But I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is simply the concern of an employer for a housekeeper." Hope bloomed in Winifred's chest, so intense it was almost painful. "What do you feel?" Fletcher's gray eyes met hers, more vulnerable than she'd ever seen them. "I believe I'm falling in love with you, Winifred Rhodes." The words hung in the air between them, momentous and irreversible. Winifred felt dizzy with emotion, months of suppressed feelings suddenly surging to the surface. "I've tried not to," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because of our circumstances, because I thought you still mourned your wife, because I feared you might see me only as an obligation." "Never that," Fletcher said fervently, raising her hand to his lips. "From the moment I saw you standing in the rain on that auction platform, something in me recognized something in you. I couldn't bear to see you sold to any of those men. So you bought me instead," she said, a hint of challenge in her voice despite the tenderness of the moment. Fletcher winced at her phrasing. I bought your contract, yes, but I never thought of you as property, Winifred. I wanted to give you a safe place to land. Nothing more was expected. And now, he took a deep breath. Now I find myself hoping for more than I have any right to ask. But I won't ask it while I hold power over your future. Fletcher reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded document, which he placed in her hands. Winifred opened it with trembling fingers, gasping when she recognized her debt contract with paid in full stamped across it in red ink. I filed the paperwork when we were in town for supplies, he explained. You're free, Winifred. You can stay or go as you choose. Your life is your own again. Tears filled her eyes as the full meaning of his gesture sank in. You've released me from my obligation. It was never right that you should pay for your father's mistakes, Fletcher said quietly. I've known that from the beginning. I just delayed acting on it because I was selfish. I wanted you here. Winifred stared at the document, emotions warring within her. Freedom, the thing she'd longed for since the sheriff had explained her fate in Kansas, was now hers for the taking. She could leave the Double C, perhaps find work as a teacher somewhere, build an independent life. Yet the thought of leaving filled her with an emptiness she couldn't bear to contemplate. And if I choose to stay, she asked, raising her eyes to his. What then? Hope kindled in Fletcher's gaze. Then I would court you properly as a free woman deserving of all respect and consideration. And perhaps if I'm fortunate enough to win your heart. He trailed off, the implication clear. Winifred's heart swelled with emotion. Setting aside the contract, she moved closer to him on the sofa. You needn't court what's already yours, Fletcher Calloway. His eyes widened at her bold declaration. Winifred, I love you, she said simply, the words feeling right and true on her lips. I've tried not to. I've reminded myself of all the reasons it's impractical and inappropriate, but love rarely listens to reason, does it? Fletcher's face transformed with joy, years seeming to fall away from his features. No, it doesn't, he agreed, raising a hand to cup her cheek. The moment hung suspended between them, filled with possibility. Then, with infinite gentleness, Fletcher leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened as Winifred responded, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. When they finally parted, both breathless, Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. Stay, he whispered. Not as my housekeeper, not out of obligation. Stay because you want to build a life here with me. Yes, Winifred answered without hesitation. Yes, winter turned to spring, and the Double C Ranch blossomed along with the renewed landscape. Winifred had taken her place as the woman of the ranch in truth as well as appearance, working alongside Fletcher as a partner rather than an employee. Their courtship, though somewhat unconventional given that they already lived under the same roof, progressed with proper respect for propriety. Fletcher moved into the bunkhouse with his men while Winifred remained in the house, a situation that prompted good-natured teasing from Daniel and the others. April brought warm winds and the promise of new beginnings. Fletcher and Winifred rode out one perfect morning to a hilltop overlooking the ranch, where wildflowers had begun to carpet the ground with splashes of color. I used to come up here when I first bought this land, Fletcher told her as they spread a blanket for a picnic lunch. I'd sit for hours, planning what I'd build, dreaming of the future. Winifred smiled, setting out the food she'd packed. And did the reality match your dreams? The ranch itself exceeded them, he said, his eyes traveling over the valley below where cattle grazed and the buildings of the Double C stood solid and welcoming. But there was always something missing. His gaze returned to her face, filled with tenderness, until now. After they'd eaten, Fletcher grew strangely quiet, his expression thoughtful as he twisted a stem of grass between his fingers. What are you thinking about so seriously? Winifred asked, reaching to brush a lock of hair from his forehead. Fletcher caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. I'm thinking that I've waited long enough. He shifted to one knee before her, still holding her hand. Winifred Rhodes, I love you more than I ever thought possible after so much loss. You've brought light and purpose back into my life. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Though she had known this moment was coming, Winifred found herself overwhelmed with emotion. Yes, she whispered, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. Yes, Fletcher, I will marry you. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the sunlight and scattered it in rainbows across the blanket. "It was my grandmother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "One of the few family treasures I kept when I left Tennessee." Winifred admired the ring on her hand, marveling at how perfectly it fit, as if it had been waiting all these years just for her. "It's beautiful." Fletcher drew her into his arms then, kissing her with a passion that left her breathless and clinging to his shoulders. When they finally parted, his eyes were dark with desire carefully held in check. "I think we should have a short engagement," he murmured against her hair. Winifred laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. "I believe that can be arranged." They were married 3 weeks later in the small white church in Trinidad, with Mrs. Larson dabbing at tears of happiness and the ranch hands standing awkwardly in their Sunday best as witnesses. Judith Blackwell made a point of attending, her expression sour as she watched Fletcher pledge his life to the woman who had once been auctioned as a debt bride in the pouring rain. The wedding supper at the Double C was a joyous affair, with neighbors bringing dishes to share and a fiddler from town providing music for dancing long into the night. When the last guest had departed and the ranch hands tactfully retreated to the bunkhouse, Fletcher swept his bride into his arms and carried her across the threshold of what was now truly their home. Later, as they lay tangled in each other's arms, Winifred traced the contours of her husband's face in the moonlight streaming through their bedroom window. "What are you thinking?" Fletcher asked, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to each fingertip. "That fate works in mysterious ways," she replied softly. "6 months ago, I stood on an auction block in the rain, believing my life was over. Now I find it's only just beginning." Fletcher's arms tightened around her. "I thank God every day for bringing you to me, even through such difficult circumstances." "As do I," Winifred whispered, settling her head against his chest where she could hear the steady beating of his heart. "As do I." Spring gave way to summer, and the Double C flourished under their joint care. Winifred's flower gardens bloomed in riotous color around the house, and she started a vegetable patch that soon provided fresh produce for their table. The ranch hands noticed the change in their boss, how he whistled while he worked, how his smile came more readily, how the shadows had finally left his eyes. In late August, as they prepared to drive a herd of cattle to market, Winifred met Fletcher at the corral with a special picnic lunch. They rode to their favorite spot on the hilltop, where a gentle breeze offered relief from the summer heat. As they ate, Winifred seemed unusually quiet, her eyes distant as she absently twisted her wedding ring around her finger. "Something on your mind, love?" Fletcher asked, concern furrowing his brow. Winifred met his gaze, a smile slowly spreading across her face. "I visited Doc Williams in town yesterday." Fletcher immediately looked alarmed. "Are you ill? Why didn't you tell me you weren't feeling well?" She reached for his hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "I'm not ill, Fletcher, I'm with child." For a moment he simply stared at her as if the words wouldn't register. Then joy blazed across his features like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "A baby, we're going to have a baby." Winifred nodded, laughing as he swept her into an embrace that lifted her feet off the ground. "Due in February, the doctor thinks." Fletcher set her down gently, suddenly concerned. "Should you be riding? Are you comfortable? Do you need anything?" "I'm perfectly fine," she assured him, touched by his immediate protectiveness. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, you know." "Not my wife," he countered, his hand moving reverently to rest against her still flat abdomen. "Not carrying my child." The wonder in his voice made tears spring to Winifred's eyes. She knew he was thinking of the baby he had lost during the war, a child he had never even had the chance to hold. "This baby will be so loved," she promised, covering his hand with her own. "So very loved." The months that followed were filled with preparation and anticipation. Fletcher expanded their bedroom to make space for a cradle, while Winifred sewed tiny garments from soft flannel and cotton. Mrs. Larson contributed a beautiful handmade quilt, and even the ranch hands got into the spirit, crafting a rocking horse from pine wood during the long winter evenings. February arrived with bitter cold and heavy snow, isolating the ranch from town for days at a time. Fletcher grew increasingly anxious as Winifred's time drew near, insisting that Daniel stay in the house, rather than the bunkhouse in case he needed to be sent for the doctor. "The baby will come when it's ready," Winifred soothed her worried husband one evening as they sat by the fire, his hand resting on her rounded belly where their child kicked vigorously. "And we'll manage just fine with or without Doc Williams." As if determined to prove her right, labor began that very night, her waters breaking shortly after midnight, startling them both from sleep. "It's time," she whispered, gripping Fletcher's hand as the first contraction seized her. What followed were 18 hours of the hardest work Winifred had ever done. Fletcher remained by her side throughout, wiping her brow, supporting her back, murmuring encouragement even as fear for her safety etched lines of worry on his face. Mrs. Larson arrived midway through the ordeal, having been fetched by James, who had braved the snow-covered roads to the neighboring ranch. "You're doing beautifully," the older woman assured Winifred as another contraction peaked. "The baby's making good progress." Just as the winter sun was setting on the second day, casting long shadows across the bedroom, Winifred gave a final tremendous push, and their son entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to Fletcher's eyes. "A boy," Mrs. Larson announced, quickly wrapping the infant in a warm blanket. "A fine, strong boy." She placed the tiny bundle in Winifred's arms, and all the pain of the long labor faded as Winifred gazed down at her son's face, red and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair like his father's. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tracing a finger along his perfect cheek. "We've been waiting for you." Fletcher sat on the edge of the bed, his expression one of awe and adoration as he looked from his wife to his newborn son. "He's perfect," he breathed, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand. 5 miniature fingers immediately curled around one of his, gripping with surprising strength. "What shall we call him?" Winifred asked. Though they had discussed names at length during her pregnancy, Fletcher met her gaze, his eyes shining with emotion. "William, after your father." The suggestion surprised her. They had considered family names from both sides, but never her father's. "You would name our son after the man who abandoned me to be sold at auction." "I would name him after the man who gave me the greatest gift of my life, you," Fletcher replied softly. "Whatever his flaws, without him we wouldn't have found each other, and now we wouldn't have this miracle." Tears spilled down Winifred's cheeks at his generosity of spirit. "William Fletcher Calloway," she said, testing the name. "It's perfect, Mrs." Larson discreetly withdrew, leaving the new family to their private joy. Fletcher stretched out beside Winifred on the bed, one arm around her shoulders, his other hand still captured in his son's grip. "I never thought I could be this happy again," he confessed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "After Sarah and the baby died, I convinced myself that kind of happiness wasn't meant for me a second time." "And now?" Winifred asked, leaning into his embrace. Fletcher smiled, his eyes never leaving their son's face. "Now I understand that life doesn't give us just one chance at joy. Sometimes it takes us through terrible storms so we can recognize the sunshine when it finally breaks through. Like a cowboy standing in the rain at an auction." She teased gently. He laughed, the sound warm and free. "Exactly like that." Young William thrived, growing into a sturdy, curious toddler who followed his father around the ranch like a shadow and charmed the ranch hands with his infectious laughter. Winifred found motherhood both more challenging and more rewarding than she had anticipated, but never regretted a moment of it, especially with Fletcher proving to be a devoted father who was as comfortable rocking a colicky baby as he was breaking a wild horse. Life at the Double C settled into a new rhythm that revolved around their growing family. The ranch prospered under their joint management, allowing them to hire additional hands and expand their operation. Fletcher's reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle spread throughout the territory, bringing buyers from as far away as Denver. In the summer of 1882, as William approached his 3rd birthday, Winifred discovered she was expecting their second child. The news delighted Fletcher, who immediately began planning another expansion to the house. "We might need the space," he explained when Winifred questioned the necessity. "This one feels different to me." His intuition proved correct when, in January of 1883, Winifred gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Thomas and Elizabeth. The house echoed with children's laughter now. and Winifred sometimes caught Fletcher watching them with an expression of such profound gratitude that it brought tears to her eyes. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset while their children played in the yard under the watchful eye of Scout, now an elderly but still vigilant dog, Fletcher took Winifred's hand in his. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "The way we began?" Winifred considered the question seriously. "I regret that my father's choices led to such desperate circumstances," she finally replied, "but I could never regret where those circumstances led me." She squeezed his hand. "To you, to our children, to this life we've built together." Fletcher raised her hand to his lips. "4 years ago today, I saw a woman standing in the rain on an auction platform," he murmured. "I didn't know then that I was looking at my future, at everything that would make my life complete. And I didn't know that the cowboy standing in the storm would become my husband, the father of my children, the love of my life," Winifred replied softly. They sat together in comfortable silence as twilight deepened around them, their children's laughter a sweet counterpoint to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling for the night. The past, with all its hardships, had led them here, to this moment of perfect contentment, and neither would change a single step of the journey. As darkness fell completely and the first stars appeared in the vast Colorado sky, Fletcher drew Winifred close against his side. "I'll always stand in any storm for you," he promised, his voice low and fervent. "Always." Winifred turned her face up to his, the love of 4 shared years shining in her eyes. "And I for you," she whispered just before his lips met hers in a kiss that held all the passion, tenderness, and promise of their extraordinary love story, a story that had begun in the pouring rain but would continue through all seasons, in sunshine and storms alike, for all the days of their lives.